Has BitLocker been broken? What Yellowkey means to you. Hi everyone, Leo Notenboom here for askleo.com. News broke recently of an exploit called Yellowkey. This allows attackers to access BitLocker encrypted hard drives without needing the usual credentials. Yeah, it's pretty simple too. Copy some files to a USB stick, reboot to a Windows recovery environment, and the drive is available in its unencrypted form. And yes, that is bad. It's really bad. Fortunately, there are a couple of requirements that make it slightly less of the total disaster that you might think. Now, I do want to qualify this. This is a case of developing news, right? This is, as they say in the news biz, this is a developing story. We haven't heard from Microsoft yet on any of this. So what I'm about to talk about might change or possibly even be invalidated as more information comes to light. Related links and updated information will always be on the article that's associated with this video, which is askleo.com/192620. All right, let's get into it. I'm going to summarize the information that is provided by the discoverer on GitHub. Again, the links are in the article that I just referenced. You copy a specific folder to a USB stick in a specific place. You then plug that USB stick into the machine that has the BitLocker protected drive. You reboot into the Windows recovery environment. Once you do that, you make sure to hold Control as it's coming up so that a Windows command prompt will show up with unrestricted access to the BitLocker protected volume. Note that nowhere in this process did you have to sign in or you didn't have to provide a recovery key. Unrestricted access to the BitLocker protected volume. Yikes. Now, there are a couple of conditions that need to be met. First off, this is Windows 11 only, although it also includes Server 2022 and 2025. For most of you watching this, it's a Windows 11 thing. The drive needs to be in the computer on which it was encrypted. In other words, removing a drive and then trying to do something, that's not going to happen. They're not vulnerable to this attack. And you must be able to reboot into the recovery environment, either already on your hard disk or on an external USB stick. That this only works when the drive remains in the computer with the associated TPM mitigates this somewhat. The attacker must have access to the machine in order to gain access to your data. Even with those conditions in play, though, the risks remain substantial. Lost or stolen Windows 11 laptops with BitLocker enabled are at risk of exposure. This is perhaps the single most ironic aspect of all this, as these are the machines most likely to have BitLocker enabled specifically because they could be lost or stolen. Machines discarded or decommissioned that perhaps relied on BitLocker encryption to ensure data could not be stolen are at risk. And devices handed over to authorities in various situations are now at risk of exposing their contents. There may be other scenarios, but the common thread here is that someone who should not have access to your machine does, and they're interested in examining what's on your BitLocker encrypted drive. Now, mitigation is tricky. The most commonly suggested is a boot time, in other words, BIOS or UEFI password. And you reboot a machine, you would have to provide this password every time in order to proceed. Also suggested, but less helpful, are things like locking the boot order so that you can't boot from USB drives. Unfortunately, there is a technique that actually allows the attacker to modify the WinRE on the hard disk. In other words, he removes the hard disk from the machine, makes the changes to the recovery partition, and then reinstalls it, so that no boot order modification is needed. There's also a scenario where you can apparently add a PIN to TPM access, but the exploit discoverer claims that he has a working proof of concept that would bypass even this. Now, there's one mitigation that I've just not seen discussed, and I think it's pretty much guaranteed to render this exploit completely moot. 1. Turn off BitLocker. 2. Use a different encryption technology. VeraCrypt for whole disk or mountable volume encryption, or Cryptomator for specific file and folder encryption. Neither relies on anything related to the current kerfuffle. Should you be worried? Well, as horrific as all this sounds, and there is no question it is horrific and embarrassing, I really don't think the average user needs to be too concerned. Let's face it, to begin with, the average user probably doesn't need whole disk encryption most of the time. Unless you travel with your computer, the chances of someone getting both physical access or possession of your machine and being savvy enough to try and break into BitLocker are pretty darned low. On the other hand, if you do travel, or maybe even if you just cart your laptop from place to place, I hope you have some form of encryption enabled. In that case, if you use BitLocker and you have sensitive data on your laptop, and you might consider yourself a target for hackers, then you probably want to do something. The only some things that I'm aware of right now that would resolve the issue are a boot time password or switching encryption technologies. Corporations, on the other hand, are very likely to be in a slight panic right now, and rightfully so. I try really hard to maintain a balanced perspective when it comes to the latest news and technology. I try not to overstate things for the sake of a headline. It's unlikely you'll see others stating that the average consumer probably doesn't need to be concerned, even though I do believe that. All that being said, that this exploit exists and that it is this simple is horrific. The anti-Microsoft crowd will have a field day, I'm sure, and I'll have a hard time arguing against them. Not even sure that I would. This is a really embarrassing, fundamental screw-up for what many would call mission-critical software. What's worse is that this is apparently going to be difficult to fix. Reports are that it's an issue with the WinRE, which is difficult to update. And I still don't get how Windows itself won't be affected somehow, since old WinREs with the issue aren't going to magically disappear. Now, it's very important here to point out what this is not. This is not BitLocker encryption having been broken. This is something else. If you take a BitLocker encrypted drive out of the machine on which it was encrypted, meaning the TPM it used at the time was no longer available, then the contents of that drive remain solidly encrypted. It's unclear and more than a little confusing exactly what this is, but again, it is not the encryption itself having been hacked. Is it a backdoor? The original researcher had this to say, quote, "I just can't come up with an explanation besides the fact that this was intentional." So, there is no proof that this is a backdoor, even though it kinda, sorta acts like one. Dave Plummer made a good point that I can absolutely attest to. Again, quoting, "In software, forgotten debug, plumbing, test hooks, and recovery shortcuts can look indistinguishable from malice once they survive into production. Intent is interesting in the end, but impact is what actually lands on the incident report. And the impact here is pretty brutal. In other words, I'm jumping immediately to Hanlon's razor before I haul out the backdoor claim. All right, what's the bottom line? What do I need to do about all this? Well, to begin with, don't panic. Unless you're in corporate, in which case, panic away. If you're an average user who's not using BitLocker, or who's using it only because Microsoft turned it on by default, then don't sweat it. Watch the show from the sidelines. If, on the other hand, you rely on BitLocker for security, then it's probably time to change your allegiance to a different encryption solution. At least add a boot time password if you can. For updates, for comments, for links related to this topic and more, and there are several reference links included, visit askleo.com/192620. I'm Leo Notenboom, and this is askleo.com. Thanks for watching.